Hello, it's Seb, and here are some books I've read. Beginning with the very first book I read this year, which was A Luminous Republic by Andrés Barba, translated by Lisa Dillman. This is a book about it's told from the point of view of a civil servant who has some success in this Latin American town in implementing a strategy for integrating indigenous people into the town. And because of that success, he's reposted to a little jungle village, I guess, like large village, small town called San Cristobal, and then weird children appear. And that's kind of what the story is about. These strange 32 children who appear in San Cristobal and start kind of unnerving people, eventually terrorizing people, and then how the town responds to that. I'm not sure what it is that drew me to this book initially, but I think it's the cover. Those like kind of white pinprick eyes just reminds me so much of the Morlocks from the 1960s version of The Time Machine, the film, which I loved as a kid. And the Morlocks in that are very scary and they look like this. However, as I read this book, increasingly it reminded me more and more of a different sci-fi classic, The Midwich Cuckoos by John Wyndham, which is one of my favorite books and which I happen to have reread very recently, which in the end I think hurt this book a lot, unfortunately, through no fault of its own, just because it touches on so many things in terms of themes and like structure and even like the plot points of what happens are so similar to the Midwich Cuckoos. It's really difficult, I think, to read a new book which keeps reminding you of a book that you love because it's always going to come up short, right? And that was the case here. The role of the narrator as this sort of insider but also outsider, and from who's also like connected to official levels of society, looking in a way down but also within this small community and how it responds and reacts to these weird children that keep on causing trouble in increasingly worrying and violent ways. The sort of uncanniness of it all, the sense of a sublime outside. In the case of Midwich Cuckoos, it's aliens, and in the case of A Luminous Republic, it's the jungle. And the jungle really links to the other aspect of it, which is not in the Midwich Cuckoos at all, which is this sort of post-colonial layer to it. Because the narrator is obviously terrible at his job, right? He's supposed to be integrating communities, and if that happened well and smoothly, then we wouldn't really have a nice novel. So the children don't belong to any one indigenous community. Their origin is sort of a mystery. They seem to be like a mix as well from different places and even towns, and so on. And in some ways, this gets rid of the problem of the coexistence between indigenous people of the jungle and the descendants of settlers and colonizers. And that's sort of a shame because that's one of the most interesting tensions in the book, and it's criminally underexplored. It's sort of put to the side in favor of the more almost sci-fi-ish elements, which again like just remind me of a book that I've already read and liked better. I think like even from the first page I thought, oh, this is a sort of post-colonial Midwich Cuckoos, and then as it went on, the post-colonial bit sort of faded away and the Midwich Cuckoos bit sort of increased, and that was to its detriment. Like this civil servant looking at the jungle saying, oh, jungle green, that's the true color of death. And then going into explanations and comparing the children to like insects in the jungle. And then as he goes on, he sort of starts to draw attention to the fact that these sort of ideas of like dehumanizing children, and especially probably indigenous children, and like seeing the jungle itself as this sort of weird other world is sort of problematic. And sometimes I feel like I'm being guided to like be critical of the narrator and his biases, and other times I feel like I'm supposed to be following in earnest his sort of philosophical musings about like humanity and love and what it means to rear children in society and so on. And like sometimes it feels uneasy because I'm not sure exactly, oh wait, am I supposed to be on board with that kind of thought, or am I supposed to be critical of it? And in a way I didn't feel like I had the psychic distance from him because it's all first person, right? To make up my own mind. So in the Midwich Cuckoos, for example, the narrator is third person, and although and also the pontificating philosophy guy is a different character, so it's really easy to keep your distance and sort of agree and disagree and question things as a reader, as a reader of these different characters. Whereas in this one I felt so much in his head, and that it felt so intimately close to this boring civil servant with his biases that I wasn't always sure like what the author wanted me to feel. And I think especially that combined with the colonial and racist stuff going on in the background made for some pretty uneasy parts of the book. It's interesting because the jungle is obviously like a source of awe and wonder. I mean, it's this sort of raw nature and the sense of sublime of all the wilderness there, and this unfettered way that life sort of explodes in that humid climate. But like often these descriptions of the jungle as something which is like completely inhuman and like anti-civilizational wilderness that, you know, cannot be tamed by anyone. It's often, you know, like white people who go there and say these things, right? The people who live there don't have these kind of conceptions of it because it's just their home, right? Also, like, this is a side note, but the author is Spanish, and I read that he lives in Argentina, which would explain why he picked this setting, but not really why he picked this way of sort of flirting with these themes about post-colonialism. You know, like, given that the Spanish are the ones who went in and, you know, created all these initial divides to do with race and to do with you know, like the dehumanizing of people connected to the jungle because the jungle is other and different from human civilization and blah blah blah. It's like yeah, I don't know, it's like if you're gonna go there, then you should properly go there, and this book doesn't really do that. So yeah, going from a book which reminded me of science fiction to an actual science fiction book. Next is Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky. So the human race is sort of like dying out, I think, and we want to terraform other planets and make them habitable for us, and one of the things that we do is we get these monkeys and a virus, like special newly invented virus, and we put them together on the planets, and the idea is that the virus will lead evolution in a path like similar to our own. So the monkeys will evolve into something like Homo sapiens. The virus will give them, you know, like it'll favor the genes which would give like increased intelligence and being bipedal and all this stuff. So to create a sort of like other intelligent life species similar to humans on different planets, and then we'll be able to, I don't know, hang out, and that's the idea. But it goes wrong because there's a fly in the ointment, or in this case a spider in the ointment, and the spiders instead of the chimpanzees connect to the virus and end up becoming the intelligent life forms on that planet. And then later on, you know, much later on, humans arrive and there is a conflict between the humans and the intelligent spiders. This book was highly recommended by people on BookTube that I really admire and like, and so I was like really looking forward to it, and I was so disappointed that I couldn't even finish it. I listened to 4.5 hours of it. No, more than that, like 4:45 or something like that. And it still wasn't even the 1/4 of the book. It was about like quarter of the way through, but just under 1/4 of the way through. I was listening to it on audio, right? And because this is pretty big, pretty massive. First of all, there was something that I misunderstood about the premise, because I thought that the reason that the spiders are the ones who end up evolving was because of, like I said, like a fly in the ointment, something going wrong, and it's humanistic hubris that led to us thinking we could control nature and so on, but actually nature ends up being something that we didn't want. We didn't want smart spiders, that's gross. We wanted smart monkeys. But actually in the first chapter we learned that the reason the plan goes wrong is because there's a terrorist attack on the ship, which ends up meaning that the ship blows up and the monkeys die, and then the virus somehow gets with spiders, and it's kind of obscure. But yeah, it ends up being a humans versus humans, and rather than humans versus nature setup, which is just less interesting for me if I don't care about either group of humans, which was the case here. What's kind of interesting about the opening is that it's like a classic sci-fi opening, that you have people on a ship and then there's a distress beacon, and you know they have to go to the distress beacon to see what's going on, and there's the mystery, the suspense, what happened to the old crew and all this stuff, right? And in a way they kind of have that setup, but we begin way earlier explaining how the distress beacon got set up by the first people who send the virus and everything, and the monkeys and the spiders and so on. I feel like the distress beacon opening is like usually a surefire trope, like that will get me hooked. But in this case, I know what the beacon is, I know why it's been there. Like there's just zero mystery. And then there's another plot, which is the spiders on the planet, which is far more interesting, because it's just something obviously that like I hadn't read before. Spiders evolving intelligently. It's kind of interesting, like to hear the nature mechanics, the idea of like how they would evolve intelligently based on their predatorial skills and so on. But still, in this story there's a problem, because I know more than all the characters as well. I know always way more than all what the spiders know, and I know more than what the humans know, and so I'm just waiting for the spiders and the humans to get together and, I don't know, like fight or have a party or do something, but they're always apart, and I don't know, I found that pretty frustrating. There's also like one thing with the spiders, the narrator calls the name character Portia, and because it's like the name of one of like the jumping spiders is Portia something, the Latin name. And so he says, let's call her Portia. Why not? Because we can't speak spider language, so I, the narrator, will call this spider Portia. So first of all, that seems a bit, I don't know, a bit of a letdown, a bit condescending in a way. I don't know, I didn't really like that naming, calling her Portia. But then also, we're going through huge stretches of evolutionary time here, right, as their species evolves. So we get like snapshots of the spiders. And so every time we have a new main character, obviously, but every time he calls the main character Portia, the narrator, I mean, I'm gendering the narrator he, but because I think it's the author, he always says Portia, let's call her Portia and her descendants. And I don't know why he did this, but the only reason I can think of is that he felt that the reader would get bored with all these new spiders. We couldn't follow it unless we imagined bridging these long stretches of time with a single subject. And so we'll say Portia for all of them, and we can kind of just pretend that it's one character going through time. And to me, it just seemed really condescending, and I don't know, like you don't trust the reader to have interest unless you have one subject persisting through all this time, when actually we know that that's not happening in the story. And so like, yeah, I don't know, I felt a bit like I was being talked down to, but I kept reading because other people had recommended this so much, and I really wanted the spiders and the humans to hang out. But eventually what made me put it down was there's also these ants on the planet, and the ants have also evolved like to be giant ants. I don't know if they're giant, I think they're pretty big, but they go to war with the spiders, and it's like a really long battle scene, and the ants have they've evolved flamethrowers, and it's explained like kind of like evolutionarily speaking how the ants have like some gas in their mouths, and there's some sort of ignition thing, and they can blow fire. They're fire breathing ants. And that was where I just turned off. I was like, okay, you've lost me. You've lost me with the fire breathing ants. It felt like when you're a kid and you draw like, oh, imagine there was all these spiders and they went to war with all these ants, and the ants can blow fire, and you just, you know, create this interesting like imaginative scenario. And then when you're an adult, you find like kind of evolutionary science that could make that possible, and then you stick it all in there. And it just felt like such a stretch, and battle scenes are, I don't know, usually pretty boring, I guess. In a way, I feel cheated because the exciting premise of this book got me like all excited to read about giant intelligent spiders, and I don't know, it just really disappointed me, but I still have that feeling now that I want to read about giant intelligent spiders. So if you know any giant intelligent spider books, please let me know. As it is, unfortunately, despite the sort of evolutionary theme, which is something I find really interesting, and despite the like great hook, I didn't survive the flamethrower ants. Then I read Dr. Fischer of Geneva, or The Bomb Party by Greene. This was, I don't know why I picked that. This just like came up on my BorrowBox app, and I'd never read anything by Greene, and I think it wasn't too long, and it wasn't, I don't know, of the ones that were there, none of his famous ones, or the ones that I've heard of, were there. This one just sounded the most interesting, and I thought, why not give it a try. This is about an English guy who loses his hand in World War II. Then he goes to Geneva to work for a chocolate company translating, because his parents were, what were they? I think his dad was a diplomat or something, and he's got these international connections, and so he speaks different languages, and so he can translate for the chocolate company into a few different languages, and that's his job. And then he falls in love with the daughter of a billionaire. Her father, Dr. Fischer, holds these mysterious exclusive elite parties for the super rich, and as much as he loves the daughter, he comes to hate her father, and that's kind of the opening. The opening shows us that this is a novel which is connected to this guy's hatred of Dr. Fischer for reasons that you find out as the book goes on. This was a really strange fairy tale-ish sort of story, I think, which focused on morality, and focused on like happiness and sadness, and how they go together and how they're distinct from each other. It focused on wealth, like kind of, like I mentioned about the ultra rich being like a sort of exclusive part of society in a way, and these sort of like elitist club things, and it's kind of funny, it's kind of mocking them. It's also about humiliation because their parties are connected to humiliation, like kind of humiliating each other, and then humiliating the main character, sometimes to do with his one-handedness as well, but like just sort of in general. The one-handedness is done really well, I think, in the novel, because it's not really about him only having one hand in any way whatsoever, but it's mentioned in a casual enough way that you feel, oh yeah, this is his disability that he has to live with, but it's not a central part of the novel at all, arguably. But yeah, there's this internationalist vibe. Another thing I really like how it was treated was the age gap, which is creepy, admittedly, between the narrator and the daughter, because he's old enough to be her father, and what I like is like the way they talk about it, is that they openly acknowledge it, you know, like you would in a loving relationship, and they sort of joke about the way that it's slightly incestuous, because in a way he seems to have been looking for a daughter figure and she for a father figure, because she's sort of like estranged from Dr. Fischer, and the way that they can sort of joke about the incestuous nature of their relationship, as well as the sort of like the big gap. And the way he feels quite insecure about the fact that he's so much older than his partner, is done, I think, really well. And finally, I guess I want to say the audiobook narrator. The narrator does a great job of doing the voices. The contrast, especially between the main character and Dr. Fischer. He does a great Swiss accent for Dr. Fischer, and I think that's difficult because Dr. Fischer is sort of the villain. So, you know, doing a sort of having a British narrator doing a British character but doing an exotic foreign accent for the villain could come across as really crass. But I think he manages to give enough like kind of life and like humanity into the character with his voice that he manages to avoid that. There's this famous Japanese pop song, Ue o Muite Aruko, or Sukiyaki, as it was mysteriously retitled when it came to America in the 1960s. But it's been said about this song that you can either sing it in a happy way or a really sad way, and you'll get like kind of a different song. And so the singer can decide, does he want it to be a happy song or does he want it to be a sad song, because the lyrics and sort of the feeling of the song are like that. And I remembered that anecdote when I read this book, because I really think it's got a lot of satire and a lot of funny jokes in it, and it could be read in a sort of merry way and lighthearted way, and like kind of emphasizing some of the ridiculousness of the plot, and some of the nature of like love and hate and so on. Or it could be read in a really sad, depressing way, which is how the audio narrator goes for. He goes for sad old man, and he does sad old man brilliantly. And there's some moments where I was completely caught up in the emotions about midway through of the old man. I was totally moved by this guy's voice when he's sort of breaking after some tragic things happen. And that was brilliant, but it also really made me wonder if I'd read the physical copy myself, would this have been much funnier? And I kind of feel that it would have been. So yeah, maybe I'll do that one day, because this is like a book I feel I definitely want to return to later in my life to see how it resonates, you know, like with me then compared to how it resonated with me now. Now it resonates well. So then I got sick and I was in bed a lot, and I had saved something just for such an occasion, which was the 1968 radio dramatization of The Day of the Triffids by John Wyndham, who I already mentioned before because he's the author of the Midwich Cuckoos. But this time I properly listened to. I read the book a long time ago, so I only like vaguely remember the story, so it was really nice to hear it again. This is a story which takes place in the Cold War, like all of John Wyndham's stuff, and there's these Triffids that live among us. They're these big plants that walk around and we kind of harvest them, and it's fine. They were created by humans through like genetic engineering of crops and stuff, and you know, this was like way before we were doing this, or at least doing this in earnest, that John Wyndham was writing about it, because he's cool and prophetic like that. But yeah, we have these Triffids and they've got a sting which can kill you, but like it's fine, we just cut off the sting, so life is good until lights appear in the sky. Everybody goes to see the lights, and then everybody goes blind. Like every human on Earth, as far as we can tell from the beginning of the novel, has gone blind, except for our main character, who was in a Triffid accident, so his eyes were covered while he was recovering in hospital. And so there's the scene which has been taken by like The Walking Dead and 28 Days Later, where the book begins with him waking up with his eyes bandaged and being in the hospital and just knowing something is wrong. Like things are quiet when they shouldn't be quiet, they're noisy when they shouldn't be noisy, and then going around and realizing that everybody in the hospital and then everybody in the world is actually blind. So that's the beginning, that's the setup. Lying in bed with my eyes closed was just phenomenal for those hospital scenes, because you can really hear like the world around you. And then the silences, obviously, like silences are made of noises, like the noises which are sandwiching the silences, or how we know the silences are there. So it's all like really carefully put together. Voices of the people, like whether they're muffled, whether they're close, whether they're far away, like it's so immersive. And then later I got better from the cold, and I'd be like walking home with my headphones in the dark, and the scenes would be like they're going, the main guy is leading blinded people around London, and so he has to like explain to them what's going on. And these scenes are just like perfect for radio and like auditory storytelling, because the blind character is saying like, what's going on, and the main character says, there's a man in the bush over there, he's going to shoot at us, I think, keep down, you have to walk quietly here to the left. He's just describing everything in a sort of expository way, which would normally be really difficult through dialogue, but which works because they're blind. And so as the main character has to describe like the physical world around them for the blind, you feel like you're the blind person having to imagine and create the world around you. Something that I didn't know when I picked this, but which became like instantly obvious to me when the opening theme began with this sort of like eerie whirring and like clanging, whooping noises, was that this was done by the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. The sounds were. And like I love the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. They like pioneered electronic music in the 1960s. They did like the theme song for Doctor Who and like all like the Doctor Who incidental music. And they created all these like amazing sound effects just using practical effects, like recording things and then speeding them up and slowing them down and creating rhythms out of like cut up bits of tape and so on. I think anyone who's interested in music should look up the BBC Radiophonic Workshop and Delia Derbyshire if you haven't heard of them, because they're both amazing. But yeah, for me, they're both The Day of the Triffids and BBC Radiophonic Workshop are so nostalgic and sci-fi and perfect, and they were here together in one narrative experience. The ending was genuinely chilling as well. Like I felt genuinely scared at what happened at the end, and I didn't remember what was going to happen at the end. But yeah, like suffice to say, this is basically the prototype for all the zombie movies that came out after George Romero. And I do kind of wonder, because this came out in 1968 and the Night of the Living Dead came out in 1968. So maybe George Romero heard this and was sort of inspired to make a film like it, or like to make his films like in this way. And that's what created the zombie genre, because basically all zombie movies are like this, are like this thing. There's no zombies in this. It's just blind people and killer plants. But like the zombie genre kind of combined the killer plant and blind people thing to create zombies, I think. That's my own personal theory anyways. Sticking with nerdy horror things, then I read Gizmo's 12 Days of Christmas. The reason I read this was because I ordered it from my library in December, before Christmas, to see if it would come, at Christmas. I didn't think it would be that popular, but it obviously was. I ordered it from my library and it only arrived like, I don't know, February or March, something like that. But like, obviously the Christmas spirit had long since gone, but I got the book, so why not read it? You're basically meant to read it to the song of 12 Days of Christmas. And the lyrics are recounting the plot of the 1984 classic Gremlins movie, which is the classic Christmas tale of Gizmo, the little mogwai, who you have to take care of by following 3 rules. Don't get him wet, don't feed him after midnight, and don't shine bright lights on him. And of course, all those rules get broken. It's an indictment of capitalism and consumer culture and the commodification of Christmas and love and warmth in general. And it's also just like this wonderful, ridiculous horror comedy film with lots and lots of film references in it. This book, though, seems kind of weird because it's like a children's book. I guess it's aimed at people who love the movie to read to their children, to sort of get their children into the movie as well from a young age. Because I think as a child, I would like it. And it does cut out like some of the more violent bits. But it also includes the bit where they say that Santa isn't real about halfway through. Like there's a line which is like, that's how I found out Santa isn't real. And that's included. So it seems that maybe you wouldn't want to read that to kids if that's the kind of, if you're as a parent, you decide you don't want to tell your kids that. So it seems like they hadn't really thought clearly about who this book was supposed to be read by, like what demographic. So that seems a bit confusing. Otherwise, it's just a bit of fun. Like if you like the movie, it's nostalgic, it might make you smile, that's about it. Then I read The Promised Neverland, volume number 5, and my goodness, this manga was an emotional roller coaster, mostly in a bad way, because This is about a group of children who need to escape an orphanage when they find out that something terrible happens to them when they reach a certain age, and so they concoct like this escape plan. This manga has the first half of the manga ends the first arc of the story, and then the second half begins the second arc of the story. Basically, what I loved about this story was the dynamic between the three main characters and the way they're sort of plotting against each other because they care about each other so much, and so they think that their way to escape is best and they need to work together, but also they know that if they put all their cards on the table, it might lessen their chances of saving everybody. And so like there's this sort of really complex web of deceit, but all based on care and trying to do what's best for the group. And all of that basically gets resolved. I'm not saying it gets resolved in like a happy ending or a sad ending. I won't spoil anything, but it all like ties up or finishes in one way or another by the middle of this volume. Then the story moves into a new phase. And in this new phase, before, we basically only had three main characters and the rest of the children were always just in the background. But now in this new phase, like the other children start talking, which is interesting because like that was something that was kind of missing, I think, from the beginning. Like that we don't hear so many voices, even though it's a big group. And they're quite young children, so that explains it. But now, even though they're young, they're getting lots of dialogue, which could be good, but it ends up working against it because all the dialogue is interchangeable. Like, I don't care about any of these kids. And unfortunately, that extends to the main characters as well. All the tensions from the beginning between the main characters are just gone. For one reason or another, they're gone. And so there's no stakes, basically. Or the stakes are just like boring stakes of like, oh no, the baddies are going to catch us, rather than the stakes of like, you know, trying to manage an interpersonal relationship between someone you care about so that they don't die, but at the same time you have to lie to them, and that stuff is all gone. It's all interchangeable dialogue in a really bog standard sort of adventure story, which reminded me of The Drifting Classroom by Kazuo Umezu, but without the intensity, the danger, the strangeness, and the artistry of that other manga. So yeah, this was incredibly disappointing because I had loved this manga up to this point, and this disappointed me so much that even though it ends on a cliffhanger, I just feel no compulsion whatsoever to continue with the series. I mean, that's a lie. I do want to continue with the series. I have a small compulsion to continue with the series, but I don't know when it's going to be, because that felt like a betrayal, honestly. The way that everything just collapsed. I'd never seen that happen so quickly in a story, that all the stakes, all the tension, everything just boom out the window. So it was a surprise, but in a way it was a kind of interesting learning experience as a writer to know, wow, you can do that. You can really do that. And then finally, I read The Hateful Age by Fumio Niwa from this anthology of Japanese short stories. This is a short story about an old woman and a family, and it begins with the scene of just like, if you go through the corridor of this house at night, the floorboard will creak and you'll hear this voice coming from the darkness saying like, who's there? This is a story about a family at the end of their tether with the old grandmother who lives with them. The old lady guarding the toilet in the dark instantly reminded me of my evil abuela, God rest her. And that was sort of nice and nostalgic. It's really fun. It's really delightful. It's nice reading people at the end of their tether always, I think. And so like we just hear people complaining all the time about this old lady and trying to pass her on to other members of the family, and this is all in post-war Japan, so you get a real sense of what it felt like in the country back then and how people struggled, but told in this like kind of funny way. And the main theme going through is that this is actually a societal problem in Japan, that loads of families are stuck with old people and they want to get rid of them because the old people aren't contributing, they're just another mouth to feed. And that's still like a kind of a tension or an unpleasant like kind of attitude and an unpleasant reality, I suppose, which is obviously at odds with a lot of, you know, Confucian-based ideas about ancestors being venerated and so on, which is still present in Japan as well. And these things are like really, I think, relevant to today in Japan, and like also all over the world, but maybe especially Japan with the aging population and so on. But yeah, to get back to the story, it's a really interesting perspective that the writer chooses, because we always get the perspectives of the complaining family members talking about the terrible things that the old woman does. But we never hear the old woman speak or get into her head, really, so we don't really understand her perspective. and that gives us a nice sense of ironic distance from what the main characters are saying. Occasionally the narrator comes in and sort of tries to guide us to say, like, maybe what they're saying isn't totally okay actually. In fact, he sometimes goes a bit too far, because he sometimes straight up says the family are this is a very hypocritical family. But nonetheless, we do feel their exasperation, and a lot of their complaints seem really legitimate. I think I'd never read this kind of perspective, whereas instead of having the unreliable narrator, instead you just have lots of unreliable characters, and make the old woman sympathetic by actually deleting her voice or her perspective from the story. It was just a really interesting form that I think I've never encountered before in writing, so that was really valuable for me. Unfortunately, the ending sort of petered out, which was such a shame, because it felt like such a strong short story that it could almost have been like the first chapter of a novel, you know, introducing a world and characters and themes and everything like that. Like, everything gets introduced and then it feels like it kind of just disappeared. So that was a real shame. But for what was there, it was really good. So if you can get your hands on this anthology, Modern Japanese Stories, edited by Ivan Morris from Tuttle Publishing. So if you can get your hands on it, then I do recommend at least that story. And I'm looking forward to reading a few more of these. These days I'm in a real short story mood, and The Hateful Age was like a great way to sort of kickstart the short story reading that I've been doing since then. But yeah, as you can see, it's been a pretty mixed beginning to 2023. Some highs, some lows, and even like the middle ones tend to have like good bits and bad bits rather than just be sort of middling. So I suppose at least it's interesting that way. So yeah, thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please like, subscribe, and if you've read anything that I talked about, or if you're interested in anything I talked about, then please comment down below and we can chat about it. Otherwise, I'll catch you in the next video. Bye bye.